very much, Henry. Eclectic is the polite word they use when it's a career you can't stick at any one job for very long. But it was a great pleasure to be here. It's a very special and important group for the reasons that Andrew and Dennis described, and it's a great pleasure to be here with Andrew and Dennis and with Jeffrey Blaney for all the reasons that Dennis mentioned. In particular, congratulations to Henry and to Juliet. Thanks for making all this happen and bringing it together, and thanks for giving me a chance to take part in this evening. You've got a terrific program this week, I know, and you're going to cover an awful lot of policy questions. And there are an awful lot of policy questions to be covered. The way in which China impacts on Australia, we hope also the way in which Australia impacts on China, raises very big questions for both countries, and we have to think about them very carefully. There's an awful lot of different ways into it. I know you've already been doing some of that today, and you'll do more of it over the next few days. But I'm going to go for the big one, because I do think there is one set of policy issues which, for Australia at least, frame all others. Frame in the sense not just the way in which the Australia-China relationship evolves, but the way in which Australia itself evolves and sees its place in the world. I think the way Australia responds to China's growing power raises some of the very deepest questions about Australia's place in the world and its sense of itself that had ever been raised since European settlement on this continent, and poses us some extremely challenging and significant questions. And I want to just sketch some of those questions tonight. It's only just dawning on us here in Australia what China's rise means. It's only just dawning on us how big China's rise is economically, and it's only just dawning on us how significant that growth in economic power is in economic and in strategic and political terms. It shouldn't be only just dawning on us. This ain't rocket science. The fact that the foundation of national power is wealth is not a particularly original one in the study of international affairs. It goes back at least to the Greeks and Thucydides and all that sort of stuff. But somehow we've managed in Australia to watch and admire and profit from China's economic rise over 30 years now, while just turning our eyes from what that means for China's power, strategic and political, for the distribution, therefore, of strategic and political power in Asia, for the way in which Asia works, for Australia's place in Asia. And we're only just now starting to wake up to that. Julia Gillard gave a speech in Melbourne last week, I think quite an important speech, very important speech from a Prime Minister, in which I think for the first time an Australian Prime Minister unambiguously acknowledged that China's economic growth changes Australia's strategic situation fundamentally. I think she also identified the significant political challenges that flow to Australia from that. Unfortunately, she stopped short of recognising what that means for the way Australia actually has to manage its relationships, in a way I'll come back and touch on in a minute. Because I do think that as China's power grows, as its wealth grows, its power grows in ways that will profoundly affect how the states in Asia relate, and therefore profoundly affect the way Australia relates to Asia, and therefore profoundly affect the way the country functions in the world and how it sees itself. The deficiency, the tantalising deficiency in Gillard's analysis last week was that she still could not see, still could not acknowledge that China's growing power means that the United States will no longer be the strongest power in Asia, will no longer lead Asia the way it has in the past, and will no longer frame Asian affairs in terms which are very congenial to Australia. This is the fundamental issue for Australia. We have, since first European settlement, since Arthur Phillip walked ashore at Sydney Cove in January 1788, security, viability of this country on this continent has been framed by Anglo-Saxon maritime power. For 233 years, I think it is this year, except for the months between the Battle of the attack on Pearl Harbor and the Battle of Midway, between December 1941 and June the 4th, 1942, an Anglo-Saxon maritime power, either Britain or America, has been the strongest maritime power in Asia, has also been the strongest country in the world, and has absolutely framed Asia for us. That is the fundamental circumstance of Australia's place in the world, which is now under challenge. And we can hardly imagine what it will be like for us when that moment passes. But we're not the only ones. Americans can hardly imagine what it will be like for them when that moment passes. Many other countries in Asia can hardly imagine that. When I talk to friends in Japan and South Korea and in many countries in Southeast Asia, even those who are much less close to America than Australia is, I find an inability to really comprehend what in a sense they well understand. And that is that if, as we all expect, I think correctly, China will most probably continue to grow fast enough to overtake the United States. It will no longer have the economic power, nor I would argue the strategic power, to play the same role in Asia that it's played for the last 40 years, and in some ways for the last 100 years, and for an Anglo-Saxon power to play the same role in Asia as they have since essentially the British defeated the French in the 1760s. So this is a profound change that all of us in Asia are struggling to come to terms with. And in a sense, of course, so is China. China too has to define its role in Asia. China too has to define what it does with the power that it's acquiring. And the way in which the United States defines its role, its response to this changing circumstance, China defines its response, the rest of us define our response. These are the ingredients for the still, I think, very unclear future new water in Asia, which is emerging. Well, what will happen? Of course I don't know. But I think we can make a clearer guess, we can make more confident judgments about the trajectory of events in Asia than most people allow by doing something very simple, but I think quite powerful. And that is just to look at the interests and options of the two biggest players. Because in the end, what happens in Asia is going to depend on the US and China and how they define their relationship. And if we look at what their choices and options are, we can see something of the trajectory. And what I'm going to say is going to sound like an oversimplification, but I don't think it is. I think their choices are actually quite simple and stark. Let's start with China. What are China's options as its power grows? What does it do with its power? Well, one option, an option that a lot of people apprehend and fear, is it will try and establish in Asia a hard hegemony of the kind, for example, that Stalin established over Eastern Europe after the Second World War. This is the classic model of the nightmare scenario of China's hegemony in Asia. And some people think it's more credible as a projection of China's strategic trajectory because China is communist and Stalin was a communist, and that's what the communists did under Stalin, therefore that's what communists will do under CCP in China. I don't think we can rule that out as a possibility, particularly not in the longer term. I don't think we can say there's no chance that China will ever try and use its power in that way, and I think an important consideration of everybody's policy in Asia is to minimise that risk. But I've got to say, I think the risk of that happening at the moment is very low, partly because I see nothing in the complexion of China's political, or for that matter, the actual development of military capabilities to suggest that that is actually China's intention. And partly because I don't think China's going to be strong enough to do it. I think China will become the strongest country in the world, the richest country in the world, the strongest country in the world. I think it will have immense strategic capacity, particularly in Asia, but I don't believe it will be strong enough to dominate Asia the way America has been able to. There are just too many other strong states, and they have too much at stake in resisting that kind of Chinese domination. And they therefore will present to China, I think, an insuperable barrier to establishing that kind of primacy. It's not what we should lie awake in bed worrying about. A second option is that China might establish a much softer kind of leadership, not imposed by sort of armed might, but the kind of much softer leadership that, for example, America has exercised in the Western Pacific, particularly since the Vietnam War, or the kind of leadership that America has exercised in the Western Hemisphere, in its own hemisphere, North and South America, since President Monroe enunciated the Monroe Doctrine in 1824. That is, you know, if you talk to others, people in America, Canadians, Brazilians, Mexicans, so on, Chileans, they give you a slightly different version from the one I'm about to give you. But actually, living in the Western Hemisphere under American primacy is not that bad. There are a few rules. You're allowed to run your own country, but if America has an interest that it's really concerned about, you have to pay attention to what America says. And you absolutely must not pay more attention to anybody else before America. Now, could we live with that? Yep, be different. Well, I think we could live with that in Australia. I think maybe even some of the Southeast Asians could live with that, but not the Japanese. But the question to ask yourself with that is, you know, it's one thing for Australia to say, okay, we'll be the Argentina to in this system. You know, the sort of relatively rich guys a fair way to the south, we're a fair way off, you know. Distance makes a big difference in this. But that's but to think of that model asks Japan to be the Canada of this system. And I love Canada dearly. It's Americanism. But I'll tell you, and Japan's a hugely, you know, itself a fascinating story. We could spend all night talking about Japan, but I just don't think the Japanese are going to cop that. And Japan alone is strong enough for all its problems to stop stop China establishing in Asia that kind of soft hegemony. I think the reason why that worked, and I think the hope that the Chinese have, as I think sometimes some Chinese do, they see that as a model for China's role in Asia, is that there are no other great powers. You can only get away with that if there are no other great powers in the system you're talking about. And there is. I think Japan is just a great power. And of course there's India. And Russia, which we can never quite forget about. And of course America hasn't actually gone away. So I don't think that's going to be an option for China either. Not saying they won't try, but I don't think that's going to be an option for China. So what else can China do? I think, frankly, the third option for China, the one that best strikes the balance for its desire for more power and influence in Asia, but a desire for stability. And I'm sure China wants both of those things. It wants to be more powerful and influential. Who wouldn't? We would. We Australians would. We were the world's strongest economy. That's a horrifying thought. No, I won't go there. But so nobody should be surprised that China wants more power and influence. And no one should be surprised that it also wants order. It wants both. And the question is, how does it best balance its desire for power and its desire for order? I think the best option for China is to share power with the United States and eventually with the others, with Japan, with India. That's, I think, much less than I would want if I was a young Chinese, if I was amongst the young Chinese in the room. I think with the sense of pride that you must have in what China's achieved, sense of China's great past, sense of recent humiliation, terrific optimism about the future, I think I'd hope to lead Asia in that soft, kindly way, like America in the Western Hemisphere. But I don't think that's going to be possible. So my hope is that China's prepared to say, okay, well that's not going to do it. But we will accept a shared leadership. I don't for a moment think China will accept less. I don't think for a moment that China will say to the United States, okay, you remain in charge of Asia, even though we're now as strong or stronger than you are economically, because you're, what, nicer, better people than we are? No, I don't think that's going to happen. I think it's expecting too much of China to ask them to accept that. What about America's choices then? America also, I think, has three options. One is to withdraw from Asia. Now, I've heard the speeches too. Every American political leader, particularly when they come into Asia, says, we are an Asian power, we will never abandon Asia, we'll always stay here. And I'm sure they mean it. But when they say it, they actually mean something a little bit different from what we hear. Because what they say, what they're really meaning is they will stay in Asia as long as their power in Asia is uncontested. And the secret of American power in Asia since the end of the Vietnam War, it has been uncontested by China, or by Japan, or by India, by any of Asia's great powers. And uncontested primacy is a bargain. I absolutely promise you that as long as American power in Asia remains uncontested, they will stay engaged. Who wouldn't? That's not the question. The question is, does America stay engaged when its power is contested by a power as strong as China? And that's a much harder question for America. I think it's quite likely that it will, but I don't think anyone should assume that there is not a future in which the United States could, not quickly like that, but slowly, step by step, a series of individual decisions which individually, each one at a time doesn't seem that significant, but towards the end, you turn back and look back over the decades and you see, oh, guess what? We've done what the British did. It can happen. And a country like Australia should not be complacent about that. The second option for America, and I think a much more probable one, is that the United States will choose not to withdraw from Asia in the face of China's challenge, but to contest it, to compete with China for primacy in Asia. I think this is in fact what's already happened. I think when you look at the way in which United States policy towards China has developed, particularly in the years since 2009, which I think history will see as the hinge point on this, we're seeing a United States which is increasingly defining its strategic objective in Asia as to resist the Chinese challenge to its primacy and build a coalition of like-minded countries, or countries they hope will be like-minded, to support it in contesting China's challenge to its primacy and preserving America's leadership as a defining feature of the Asian order. No one in Washington, and for that matter no one in Canberra, wants to call that containment. But if it walks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, let's call it a duck. This is a policy of containment. And the problem with the policy of containment is it appears grossly incompatible with the fact that China is economically essential to the United States and to the rest of us. That's right. That doesn't mean the name's wrong, it means the policy's bad. So America does have a third option. The third option is the equivalent of China's third option, the option of sharing. The option of entering into an agreement with China in which leadership in Asia is shared between them. Now, how does that happen? Immensely complicated story, but quite simple in essence. The US and China and India and Japan have to agree to settle the key issues in Asia between the two of them, eventually the four of them. I think that those four that end up being the critical powers. And in particular, they have to agree that none of them will try and dominate the country, the region as a whole. That they will all negotiate their differences peacefully, and that if any of them tries to break that, they'll face the combined wrath of the other three. It's not a very complicated deal, terribly complicated to reach, not very complicated to conceive. And there are some historical metaphors of which the concert of Europe in the 19th century is the best. But I don't predict it's going to happen. I think it's the best outcome, clearly the best outcome for China. Entering into strategic competition with the United States for China would be a disaster. America is a terribly powerful country and a very dangerous adversary. Also, best outcome for the United States. For the United States, entering into strategic competition with China would be a disaster. Because China is the most formidable strategic adversary the United States has ever faced. When I say that to my many American friends, they look at me blankly. And I say, yeah, of course, the Soviet Union was more threatening, and it was better armed, but it was poorer. What makes China so threatening to the United States, so formidable as an adversary, is simply its strength. The United States has never faced an economic peer competitor before. This is completely different from anything in America's historical experience, and I don't think that's a message which Americans have quite absorbed yet. But, and the fact that they haven't absorbed it is reflected in the fact that, as I say, I think the trajectory of American policy today is to contain China. And it's worth making the point that the trajectory of Australian policy today is to support it in doing so. Now, some people think I'm being too gloomy. It's possible to say, no, look, this escalating strategic competition between the United States and China is not inevitable, and in particular, in fact, it probably won't happen because the US and China are so dependent on one another economically. That is a huge issue. It's terribly significant. that the US and China are economically interdependent as much as they are. It's, at least in scale and degree, probably unprecedented to have competing powers with such a high level of interdependence. But it doesn't guarantee that the interdependence will trump the competition. The interdependence raises enormously the incentives for the two countries to find a way to get on. It doesn't remove the need to find a way to get on. In fact, you could say that unless they can find the kind of power sharing model I've suggested, if they follow the logic of the policy of competition which both are pursuing at the moment, the integration will erode. It will suffer. It can't be sustained. So at some stage, either politicians on both sides of the Pacific are going to have to say, okay, we're going to forego our strategic objectives in order to preserve our economic integration. Or they'll have to make the other sacrifice. They'll have to say, we're better let our economic interests go in favour of strategic competition. Now, if humankind and our political leaders were always entirely rational, then we'd know which one they take. But if humankind and our political leaders were always entirely rational, I would have been out of the business a long time ago. So what are Australia's choices? The choice for Australia is very stark. We have always regarded the domination of the Western Pacific by first Britain and then America as a necessary and sufficient condition for our security. But now, in this new circumstance, with a challenge to the old Western maritime primacy in Asia of a scale we have never seen since Arthur Phillip arrived, we have to ask whether supporting American primacy in Asia is any longer the best outcome for Australia. It's terribly difficult for Australians to comprehend that we might not support this. It's terribly difficult for us to imagine living and working in an Asia which is not managed for us and kept safe for us by American power. But the costs and the risks of supporting the United States in escalating strategic primacy with China are immense. They are comparable with the biggest costs and risks that Australia has ever faced strategically. Because there is no reason to assume that escalating strategic competition between the United States does not lead to war. And there is no reason to believe that that would not be the worst war in human history. Big claim. But this is, let us remind ourselves, a war between nuclear-armed states. Don't have much experience of that yet. This is a very dangerous situation. Now, our sense of our history, for many of us, depending on how you use that word, the sense of our values, our instincts, all incline us to say we should support American primacy. And it's almost impossible for an Australian political leader to say anything other than that, we support American primacy. And that's what Julian Gillard said last week. But our interests and our future, I think, would argue for us supporting the idea of the United States entering into a power sharing arrangement with China. And last week, in the LSE, Malcolm Turnbull became, I believe, the first Australian political leader to support that proposition. A very important speech, interesting speech. Go and read it. And send them a congratulatory telegram from me. But of course, when you say that, a lot of people hear you say something else. They don't hear you say you think the US should share power with China. They hear you say, I think the United States should relinquish leadership to Asia. They hear you say, we should stop supporting the United States and start supporting China instead. That is simply not the proposition. It's only the proposition if you believe that there are only two possible futures for Asia, either American domination or Chinese domination. And the whole point of my argument is that there is a third option. There better be a third option. Because neither of those two are going to work. Chinese domination will be risky and uncomfortable. American domination will just be a conflict. We don't have the option of keeping the kind of order we've had for the last 40 years, which has been as sweet as anything. That's not going to happen. If we support American primacy, we're supporting escalating strategic competition, which doesn't work for us. So we have to imagine for ourselves, we Australians have to imagine for ourselves a future for Asia which is neither one framed by American primacy or framed by Chinese primacy, but framed by a completely different kind of strategic order in Asia of a kind that we have never lived in before. And this is an effort of the imagination which stresses us. But we've faced such challenges before. In the 1880s, as Britain's power declined, we started thinking to ourselves, or our ancestors started thinking to themselves, how can we reconfigure the way these 6 colonies operate on this continent to secure ourselves in an era in which the motherland is no longer the dominant power? Well, part of the product of that process was federation, and this building actually is part of that story. We take federation for granted, of course. Well, obviously these 6 states were always going to federate to a single country to function as a single strategic entity. No, it wasn't inevitable at all. It was a major achievement of reimagination, to reimagine the kind of country Australia was and its place in the world. After the Second World War, when the empires in Asia, the European empires in Asia collapsed, and Australia started thinking about how it would relate not to a region of empires, but to a region of independent Asian states. Australia again completely reinvented itself as a country. Actually, Andrew will want me to say the foundation of ANU was part of that process. It really was, actually. And you could say that in the late 60s and early 70s, when we opened to China, terribly significant step in our national history. And when we started thinking about how we could defend the continent unaided, and started reconfiguring our relationship with Indonesia and so on, you could say that too was a great turning point with a great deal of vision. So Australian statesmen have faced up to this kind of challenge before. I think we do now, though, face the biggest challenge, challenge bigger than either of those 3. It's a challenge to imagine what it's like for Australia to function as a society in an Asia which is no longer framed by the primacy of our Anglo-Saxon great and powerful friends. But back in the early 90s, Bob Hawke gave a speech in which he talked about Australia in future having to look for its security not from Asia, but in Asia. And I think that phrase turns out to have been quite prescient. That, of course, is going to require us to rethink our relationship with the United States in very deep ways. It's going to require us to rethink the role we expect of the United States in very profound ways. It's going to require us to rethink our view of China in very profound ways. And, of course, it's going to require us to rethink our sense of ourselves in Australia. Thank you very much.